An all-powerful dynasty, a whispered betrayal, a very public assassination. The story of Julius Caesar has all the elements of an edge-of-your-seat drama, but did his actual death follow the oft-told story? Not exactly. It's worth taking a look at a bit of history behind Julius Caesar's assassination, because that history plays into the motives of those who finally took matters into their own hands. According to history, Caesar was kinda thrown into the middle of a losing battle from the beginning. The Roman Republic was struggling to keep itself afloat, and after almost 500 years, the ship was already sinking. Caesar stepped up with some important incentives that were meant to not only shore up the leaks, but also cement his place at the top. The problem came when he started passing on input from the Senate on major changes. That didn't sit well with a group of very powerful people who saw Caesar being bestowed titles like dictator for life. But here's the thing. Cornell history professor Barry Strauss says that the idea that the assassins were patriots who wanted to return Rome to the powerful republic it had been wasn't the whole truth. He explained it like this. I think politicians don't have a firewall between ideals and practical benefits. They think what's good for the country is also good for themselves. The senators who joined the conspiracy against Caesar can sincerely say he was a threat to the republic and to them and their way of life. Sure, Julius Caesar was stabbed a whole bunch of times on March 15, 44 BC, but what really happened that day? Strauss says that it was really started not with Brutus, that's an idea we get from Shakespeare, but with a man who had his name misspelled by the bard, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. It was actually Decimus who was a trusted companion and friend to Caesar, who had dinner with him the night before his assassination, and who helped convince him that everything was absolutely fine and he should definitely just go about his business like normal. So Caesar did. He went into the portico of Pompey, a senate house dominated by the statue of his frenemy, Pompey the Great, and took his usual seat on his throne. It wasn't long before one conspirator named Cimber approached, then grabbed Caesar's toga.
What are you waiting for? No! No!
Historians believe that it was Casca who struck the first blow, and Strauss says the assassins were likely carrying daggers. The history professor also claims that some were tasked with preventing escape or interference from outside the group, while others did the actual killing. In front of about 200 senators and countless aides, slaves, and secretaries, Caesar was killed in what was less of a noble fight and more of a bloody, dirty struggle. He did fight back, stabbing at least one of his attackers in return, but ultimately succumbed to multiple stab wounds. In 2003, Colonel Luciano Garofano, an expert in forensic investigation and forensic medicine, took a look at reviewing what we knew about Caesar's assassination and what conclusions could be drawn from a perspective of our modern medicine. He noted that even as the chaos descended on Rome, Caesar's body lay in the Senate house for around 3 hours before it was picked up by servants. By the time he was carried home, word had spread, and people crowded into the streets crying for their fallen leader. Julius Caesar's body was only examined by a doctor once he was returned to his home, and according to History Collection, this is where things get a little confusing. The physician's name was recorded as Antistaius, and it's unclear whether or not he was Caesar's personal doctor. He did, however, document all 23 stab wounds and concluded that only one wound had been fatal. Interestingly, the Institute of Forensic Medicine says that the idea of mortal wounds was already one that was incredibly familiar to the era's doctors. It wasn't entirely surprising then that Antistaius' findings were reported in the biography of Caesar by Suetonius. Of so many wounds, none turned out to be mortal in the opinion of the physician Antistaius, except the second one in the breast. The wound in question was the one that entered below his left shoulder blade, and there are a few ways that could have killed him. The angle of the stab wound described by Antistaius could have punctured his heart, but it's also possible that it perforated his lung instead. In that case, his lungs would have collapsed and his chest cavity would have filled with blood, killing him. There's also a third option. It may have severed an artery. Ultimately, the cause of death was extreme blood loss. Interestingly, that also means Caesar had time for last words, not et tu brute as Shakespeare recorded, but you too, my child? There's a difference, and some historians think that's more meaningful than it's generally credited as being. The study and documentation of Julius Caesar's body was the first autopsy performed in recorded history. History Collection says that it was important for another reason too. It gave the name to the entire field of forensic science, and the idea of studying what's left in death to get a better idea of what had happened at the end of life. Antistaius didn't just record his findings, he reported them in a very public presentation. According to an article published in Research and Reports in Forensic Medical Science, the physician's presentation on Caesar's 23 stab wounds and his determination that it was a single thrust that killed him was conducted in the public forum. Forensic, they say, comes from the Latin for "from the forum" and has come to be connected with precisely what Antistaius was doing. creating a snapshot of exactly what happened when one of the most famous or infamous Roman rulers in history was assassinated by his own Senate. When forensic investigator Luciano Garofano took another look at the original autopsy in 2003, he made some pretty wild observations. As one of the top criminal investigators and lecturers of his own era, he had plenty of experience to draw from, and for him, the assassination reminded him of something much more modern. Antistius' original autopsy notes that most of the wounds were concentrated in two areas, Caesar's face and groin. The message of emasculation is pretty clear, but it was the wounds to the face that Garofano was particularly interested in, especially considering that at least one of the slashes came after Caesar had already fallen and was clearly dying. Disfiguring a target's face sends a pretty clear message, but that's not all he noticed. The multiple assassins, each taking a turn, had parallels in the modern mafia, too.
I think the murderers thought if lots of them stabbed him, it would be everyone's responsibility. We'd all be in it together. They'd all be in it together.
Garofano's work draws other comparisons between modern mafia families and the high-ranking, powerful senators of Rome's past. He stresses that they share an unflinching loyalty to the heads of their families, despise weakness, constantly strive for more power, and take the uncompromising view that violence is a completely legitimate option for reaching their end goals. Contemporary historians recording the days and weeks after Julius Caesar's death say there were some who wanted him thrown in the Tiber River before all his legislation was undone in an attempt to turn back the clock a bit. World history says that it was Mark Antony who stepped in and prevented the entire thing from spiraling even more out of control.
The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar.
The original plan was for Caesar to be cremated on a funeral pyre in the Field of Mars after his March 20th funeral, but the angry crowd took the body, returned it to the Forum, and burned it there. Interestingly, it's a history by Appian of Alexandria that shed a fascinating glimmer of light on just how important Antistius' autopsy and findings were to the Roman people, a people who were shocked and stunned by the sudden assassination of their leader. Appian wrote that after Mark Antony's speech, the crowd called for the conspirators to be brought to justice.
They were traitors!
Appian recorded the spectacle that unfolded. Someone raised above the bier a wax effigy of Caesar. The effigy was turned in every direction by a mechanical device, and 23 wounds could be seen savagely inflicted. This sight seemed so pitiful to the people that they could bear it no longer. Howling and lamenting, they surrounded the Senate house where Caesar had been killed and burnt it down. Along with Luciano Garofano's second look at Antistius' autopsy notes, he also conducted a more modern investigation. Using the ancient physician's observations, Garofano used 3D imaging software to recreate the 23 wounds and get an actual picture of what Caesar's body would have looked like. Then he staged a few recreations of the murder scene. Exactly how many senators were involved in the conspiracy and the eventual assassination has always been a little unclear and ranges from National Geographic's 40 to history's 60. But how many actually got blood on their hands? According to Garofano, it was fewer than historians and criminologists have thought. He ran the scenario 3 times. First, he had 23 attackers stabbing their Caesar once each, and then it was lowered to 11 attackers, then 5. He quickly came to the conclusion that there was no way 23 men would be able to get a single stab thrust short of some well-organized fight choreography and a victim that didn't mind being stabbed. It was even tough to juggle 11 attackers, and it ultimately led him to the conclusion that Caesar had only been stabbed by somewhere between 5 and 10 people. Hindsight now has many experts suggesting that Julius Caesar knew that his time was limited, and some of the actions his contemporaries condemned as those of a man getting too big for his britches actually had roots elsewhere. When some senators offered to shower their leader with gifts meant for a god, he infamously refused to stand, and it was a massive offense. He also ignored portents and warnings and didn't read a letter he had been handed just before the assassination, warning that he was in danger. That doesn't sound like the savvy politician and strategist he was known for being, and Garofano's consultation with Harvard Medical School forensic psychiatrist Dr. Harold Burstein led to a surprising conclusion. Caesar already knew that he was dying. Burstein believes that Caesar was suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, which caused symptoms like seizures and a loss of control of the bowels, especially when under stress. That, he argues, is the real reason Caesar didn't stand for the senators, and it was his illness that led him to make some of the increasingly irrational decisions that ultimately led to his fall from grace. Add in his renowned vanity, and Burstein suggests that suicide began to seem a more attractive option than seeing his illness progress further. Rather than face a slow public decline, Caesar may have decided to goad his assassins into helping him go out in a blaze of glory. History Collection says there's a fascinating bit of history that can be pulled from Antistius' autopsy. The conclusion that only one of the 23 wounds was serious enough to kill him and that he ultimately bled to death makes it likely that yes, he definitely did have time for some final words, and the parting words of the real Caesar might be way more interesting than what Shakespeare's fictional version had to say. Roman historians say that his last words were actually kai su teknon. That's Greek for "you too, my child," and here's what some historians think was going on. Cornell University's Barry Strauss believes that Caesar's last words were rehearsed and that he knew Brutus was going to be one of the assassins. He also argues that his last words were meant to be taken literally, as Brutus really was Caesar's biological child. It's a theory that's not without merits. Caesar's long-running affair with Brutus's mother Servilia was widely known, and even though Caesar was only 15 years old when Brutus was born, the possibility was hinted at in the writing of ancient historians like Plutarch. That would make Caesar's last words mean something completely different. Not only was Brutus an assassin, but he had assassinated his own father. Forensic investigator Luciano Garofano did some psychological profiling too, and he came to the conclusion that Caesar's actions in the last months of his life were those of a man who wanted to make sure his name was never ever forgotten. Just 6 months before his assassination, Caesar wrote a new will naming his nephew Octavian his heir. Octavian would go on to be the first Roman emperor, and it was a pretty brilliant political move. Not only did it make sure someone in his bloodline remained at the top of Rome's political pyramid, but he also added something that guaranteed the Roman people would demand justice. He awarded every Roman citizen 3 months of living expenses, making sure they could mourn him properly and bring his assassins to justice. The result? Everything that Caesar wanted. Harvard Medical School forensic psychiatrist Dr. Harold Burstein says that not only did Caesar's political maneuvering and death by assassins guarantee he would be immortalized for thousands of years, but it also put him firmly on the right side of history. It turns out that Caesar's seemingly unexpected assassination may have been his plan all along.